Northern Ireland, 1989. Violence claims 81 lives. Killer gangs terrorise the streets. Close quarter murders commonplace.
The British state colluded with paramilitary assassins in facilitating the murder of citizens. It's that simple.
Michael Finucane's father, Patrick, is the 8th person to die that year. His family, like many others in the conflict, forced to watch a loved one murdered in his own home by ruthless, faceless gunmen. Memories of those lost lives have become dim over the years, but the murder of Pat Finucane lives on. That same government stands accused of attempting to impede, delay or influence the Stevens team that's investigating collusion by the security forces. Tonight in Insight, the record of a critical meeting involving Sir John Stevens, including taped extracts, which indicate that those attempts at obstruction are continuing. And we meet Peter Corrie, the Canadian judge who's urging a public inquiry into the Finucane case. But we won't meet, at least not yet, the shadowy government figures who knew more about the murder of Pat Finucane than they want to tell you. Journalist Hugh Jordan is co-author with David Lister of a recent book on UDA leader Johnny Adair. The two writers heard the unnamed gunman who shot Pat Finucane boast about the murder.
He knew every detail from the start of arriving at the house and seeing the front door open, to the description of that it was a wee mortice lock, and then what happened in the house, and with Mr. Finucane being lying dead on the floor.
UDA military commanders met in December 1988 to discuss plans to kill 3 solicitors who'd represented Republicans in high-profile cases. Pat Finucane was top of their hit list. Pat Finucane's murder was plotted and executed by members of the UDA's B Company on the Shankill Road. The company commander at the time was this man, Jim Spence. Intelligence and a photograph of Finucane were provided for the triggermen by this man, Brian Nelson. One of the guns used in the murder was provided by the company's quartermaster, William Stobie. Ken Barrett was involved as well. He confessed first to a policeman and then to a television reporter that he had been part of the killer gang. One of the murder weapons was later found in the home of a North Belfast man, and he was jailed for 4 years. Before 1989 was over, West Belfast UDA commander Tommy Little arranged for me to meet members of the UFF, who showed me photo montages and a videotape of IRA suspects. They had been filmed inside a security base. Police and soldiers were providing such a steady flow of information to Loyalist hitmen that English policeman John Stevens arrived to investigate collusion. Since then, John Stevens has not been able to extricate himself from Northern Ireland's problems. He's made a career out of investigating collusion and is currently on his 3rd inquiry into Loyalist connections to the security forces. Stevens' arrival forced the UFF to reorganise. They became more efficient killers, but since the ceasefires they've fallen out among themselves. The proud UFF killers of Pat Finucane, shoulder to shoulder not so long ago, would now gladly kill each other, as suspicion fuels the paranoia that grips the organisation.
It's an incredible situation where people who were so close at one time are now looking at each other with suspicion, and as the months pass, the intensity of aggression towards each other gets more pronounced. And I would not be surprised if very soon there was an eruption of violence because of these intense pressures.
Colin Bell was a foot soldier in the UDA's brigade in Scotland. He's one who nurses deep suspicions, and with good reason. In December 1992, he was preparing for a secret mission from Glasgow.
Left Glasgow. Had 6 handguns, actually in the car. We were actually in the skin of the panel at the passenger door. Got to the Port of Cairnryan about quarter to 7 in the morning, and there was a heavy presence of police there. Routine stop check.
It wasn't just a routine check, and Colin Bell was about to go to jail for 5 years.
After being detained, stripped the car, and that has been the fun, the 6 handguns, which were actually packed into the passenger door.
Where were you to take those guns?
They were heading to West Belfast.
In prison, Colin Bell had time to contemplate. On his release, he travelled to Belfast to see his UDA friends, but by now suspicious that one of them had informed on him.
I've actually had a conversation with Jim Spence in his old house in the Highfield, in his kitchen. When he put it to me, who did he think it was that squealed on us? And I told him, I says, I think it was someone from Belfast. I says, for the simple fact is, why not let the guns travel to the destination they're supposed to go to? You know what I mean? If you think the mind of the police, that's what police, you know what I mean? That's what the police would do. They would let you travel all the way, and then they would scoop everybody.
What did he say when you suggested to him that the information would come from Belfast?
Thought it was ridiculous. Thought it was ridiculous.
Colin Bell says he was left guessing until recently about the identity of the informer. That wasn't until these letters arrived with UDA commander Johnny Adair at Maghaberry prison. They were written by one of the Pat Finucane killer gang, Ken Barrett. In them, Barrett admits to being a special branch informant whilst a military commander in the UFF. He claims he was forced to leave Northern Ireland because he was spotted witnessing a meeting between some special branch officers and another UDA leader. That leader, he says, was Jim Spence. Adair was one of Spence's closest friends in the past. From his prison cell, he's been making allegations in newspapers about Spence.
This is about a man who has been passing on information to the intelligence agencies for almost 2 decades. I believe that the UDA was hoodwinked, or some of their members who were completely innocent, who have not been double agents, who probably played a role in it, but who were hoodwinked, who didn't know that their senior officers who were sending them out to do it was doing it in behalf of the British government, because they were working for either the FRU, the Special Branch, or the MI5.
In Scotland, Insight met with this man, Sam McCrory. He too claimed he'd been set up by Jim Spence. He said Spence had asked him to move a car from West Belfast to Tuckmona. But the murder was abandoned when the Republican target failed to show up. Then McCrory was arrested and got 5 years in jail. It was time to visit Jim Spence. We called at his West Belfast home to confront him with the allegations from his former comrades. He denied everything.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That's Johnny Hammond making all these things up. And bear in mind that there's no love between any of us.
So you say that the allegations that are being made by Adair and the others are simply an ongoing part of the feud?
Yes, absolutely. I can tell you now, I have never sat with Special Branch and discussed the murder of Pat Finucane, MI5 or anybody else before, after, whatever.
In the paramilitary world of mistrust and suspicion, Spence's words may silence some of his comrades, but for others they fall on deaf ears. Gary Smith, comrade of Johnny Adair, is one of them.
For me to say, you know, kill this man, I would be then put myself in a position with the authorities to say kill this man. You know, what I'm saying is stand up and look at this man. You know, whatever happens to this man, then shoot. It's up to themselves.
Has he ever done you any harm?
Oh, no, not at all.
But you're prepared to do him harm?
For what I believe in, yeah. Because I have no doubt, if that man knew of any situation that I had been involved in, on any active service, then he would have informed, and he had prepared to do me harm.
In the course of working on this book, we learned quite a lot about Jim Spence. A senior officer told me that Jim Spence worked for the Royal Ulster Constabulary Special Branch.
Now, he's denied that, as you say. I've been to see him as well, and he says he's not been involved as an agent. He claims that these stories are being put about by Johnny Adair and his cohorts as part of the feud.
I would suggest that Jim Spence was working as a Special Branch informer throughout that period. I don't know if he still is, but I think that all the evidence on the ground and with security force representatives would suggest that he was.
This wall mural features faceless men as the usual suspects in collusion. But remember the faces of the Loyalist gang we named earlier as having had a role to play in the Finucane murder? Well, they give cause for concern because they were all working for various agencies of the state. It was enough reason for the Finucane family and their supporters to claim state collusion in murder. Their campaign, plus evidence uncovered by Sir John Stevens and political pressure, were factors that forced the government to act. They went to Toronto and found Peter Corey, but he wasn't prepared for the culture shock.
It was the depth of suspicion on both sides about the actions of the other side.
Corey, a retired Supreme Court judge, was happy to accept the British and Irish invitation to come to Ireland, north and south, to investigate 6 controversial murders, including Pat Finucane's. The first thing he discovered was an attitude among many people here.
The hatred that seemed to be just below the surface, that's a harsh word, but I think it was accurate. And that was sad and upsetting to see.
But Corey bent to the task, confronting thousands of archived documents that might give him some clues about collusion. The task would be a lonely one, dining alone, working quietly away month after month in different locations, all of them secure, some with barred windows. He would not allow himself to make friends, fearing that he might be seen by one side or another to be playing favourites, but he was never alone at his workplaces.
Some other places were unpleasant. On the Finucane Ministry of Defence, very secure documents, very sensitive. And even during the course of the day, when I had to use the facility, somebody came with me and back again.
Judge Corey praised Sir John Stevens and his team of detectives for their help in making documents available. How high did these documents go?
Very high.
We're talking about cabinet level, for example?
I don't know. Now, some documents indicated that they were referred to cabinet. No cabinet documents as such, but a reference to copies to Office of the Cabinet or whatever. But yes, they were secure.
Did that surprise you?
No. If you're getting into this, I would expect to see that.
So the government would be informed of what was happening in these sensitive documents, the intelligence gathering?
Of some things. Now, you have no idea when you say informed how far up the scale they go, whether it's to a permanent undersecretary or someone in the civil service. There's no way of knowing.
The Finucane family says the discovery of that sinister trail is critical to their concerns.
I don't believe I can summarise it any better than a phrase that was used by another member of my family, and it's this: the people who pulled the trigger are not the most important, it's the people who pulled the strings.
As a measure of how far apart the government and the Finucane family are, Michael Finucane says the family would forgo the prosecution of the killers for an open public inquiry, as Corey himself recommended.
If I could be satisfied that that inquiry process was thorough enough to get to the truth, to get to the bottom of this, who was responsible, who set it up, who ordered it, who maintained it, who funded it, who resourced it, who covered it up for so many years. If a public inquiry answered all of those questions, yes, I would forgo the prosecution of the triggermen. But I do not have that inquiry, and there's only one person to blame for that: Tony Blair.
Apart from the family and Judge Peter Corey, a large number of prominent groups here and abroad have mounted pressure on the Blair government, supporting the call for an inquiry.
I was at a meeting a couple of years ago with the Finucane family and Tony Blair, and I told him at the time that this murder did not happen on his watch, and his government could be part of the solution by holding a public inquiry. And I also said to him that if they didn't hold a public inquiry, they would become part of the problem. I think we have now reached the point where they are definitively part of the problem, and they are guilty of collusion just as their predecessor governments were.
For more than 15 years, successive British governments have failed to respond to calls for an inquiry. At the centre of the collusion allegations are comments in Parliament by this man, Douglas Hogg, when he was a junior minister in the Thatcher government. He spoke only 3 weeks before the Finucane murder. Some considered the remarks a blank cheque for loyalist assassins.
I have to state as a fact, but with great regret, that there are in Northern Ireland a number of solicitors who are unduly sympathetic to the cause of the IRA.
His comments caused outrage, but he stood by them, even though successive police investigations did not produce evidence to support Hogg's claims.
I think there's already a lot of evidence that the murder of Patrick Finucane was canvassed at very high levels. We know that Brian Nelson's information went as far as Cabinet. We know that Douglas Hogg was briefed by the Chief Constable. And what we don't know is what he did about that briefing and who else he informed and whether any decisions were made on the back of it.
Will that ever come out into the public domain?
If there is a public inquiry and if it is properly conducted, then it should come into the public domain.
Remember what Judge Corey said about copies of documents sent to Cabinet? Individually, they might only provoke suspicion about what government ministers really knew. But collectively, along with other evidence, like comments from Douglas Hogg, could they directly connect the government to state murder?
I am not in the least bit surprised that Judge Corey has come across documentation marked for the attention of Cabinet. Perhaps the only surprising element of Judge Corey's discovery is that these documents still exist.
You said that you did see documents that referred at some level to Cabinet. Were any of those documents that you saw referring to Cabinet, did any of those documents concern the people in the Loyalist organisation, the UFF, involved in the Pat Finucane murder?
Oh gosh, I honestly cannot say with regard to that. I'd have to take another look at the document. You see that I wasn't particularly looking for anything that said Cabinet. I can remember that on some documents there was a carbon copy or a copy sent to Cabinet Office. And as I told you earlier, I have no idea, and there's no reference to anything of it going any higher. So I don't know. So much of this is going to have to turn on a public inquiry where there's an opportunity to explore, to call witnesses, examine, cross-examine, and have that body make findings of fact.
Although Judge Corey believes he saw every document he was entitled to see, after studying his report, Jane Winter is not so sure.
I don't think that he can have seen all of the documents. We would imagine from other cases that there would have been minutes of the Joint Intelligence Committee, perhaps even Cabinet minutes, and he doesn't refer to any of those in his report, so I'm not sure that he has seen everything that he should have seen.
He did say that he saw papers that were referred to Cabinet, but he said that's as far as he went with his questions.
I think that may have been because he felt that his remit was limited to establishing whether or not there had been collusion, and he felt that once he had established that, he didn't really need to go any further, but a public inquiry would obviously have to look at everything.
This is how the Secretary of State, Paul Murphy, responded to Judge Corey's recommendation for a public inquiry into the Finucane murder.
In the Finucane case, an individual is currently being prosecuted for the murder.
On its own, this statement may sound positive, but it was the government's way of explaining why the Finucane inquiry would not begin straight away, like the others recommended by Judge Corey.
The police investigation by Sir John Stevens and his team continues. It is not possible to say whether further prosecutions may follow. The conclusion of the criminal justice process in this case is thus some way in the future. For that reason, we will set out the way ahead at the conclusion of prosecutions.
Set out the way ahead? What does that mean? We invited the Secretary of State to tell us simply whether or not there would be a public inquiry. He declined to be interviewed. Instead, we were given a two-page statement basically repeating what he'd said at Westminster. Corey was less than impressed with this stalling tactic.
Disappointed, for reasons that I tried to put forward in the report, that this is one of those rare instances where a public inquiry may be more important to the community than a prosecution or prosecutions.
In the High Court, Geraldine Finucane is continuing her battle for a judicial review. Her barrister claims political pressure has been applied to the Stevens detectives, urging them to say a whole string of prosecutions was in the pipeline, the effect of which would enable the government to go on and on delaying the public inquiry they promised. How did the barrister know about the political pressure? Because he knew what was said at a meeting a few weeks ago between the Finucane family, Sir John Stevens, and 4 of his detectives. This written record of the meeting reveals that Detective Chief Superintendent Dave Cox told the Finucane family that the only impediment to a public inquiry was the Barrett trial. He bristled at a suggestion that Stevens had been a political appointment by revealing that the Stevens team, during consultation over the Corrie report, actually found it necessary to take steps to ensure that they could not be used by government to block a public inquiry. In other words, Stevens was anticipating and resisting political interference. In this secretly taped extract of the meeting obtained by Insight, we hear Chief Superintendent Cox respond to the suggestion that the Stevens investigation would be used as an excuse to avoid a public inquiry.
What I would say is that quite vigorously we have positioned ourselves so that that very thing you're saying, that we will be used as an excuse to prevent a public inquiry, cannot take place.
Sir John Stevens declined to be interviewed, saying it was not appropriate to comment on what may or may not have been discussed at a private meeting. We contacted the Crown Prosecutor's Office in Belfast. We wanted to know if the 20 or so files relating to the Finucane case meant there might be a string of prosecutions in the pipeline. A spokesman was unable to answer that question. For Finucane's campaigners, it's become easier to conclude that for some reason this case is politically very sensitive.
I get the feeling that this particular government is more concerned about its ability to deal with its own securocrats with MI5 than it is with telling the truth about this particular murder.
Because of the length of time that has gone by, 15.25 years now, and we know that Brian Nelson has died and Stobie has been murdered. And with this length of time going by, memories do fade. And the efficacy, the success of a public inquiry is jeopardized by every day, week, month that goes by. And that's sad. It is something that is as important as this to the community.
The Finucane murder stands out from thousands of others because of the extent of state collusion in his death that's already been established, not to mention the deep suspicions about what yet is to enter the public domain. At the very least, the state stands accused of turning a blind eye to murder, perhaps on a regular basis. We asked Judge Corrie to comment on the fact that 6 of the UFF gang involved in the Finucane murder were working for branches of state security.
That's something for a public inquiry. All those names are referred to in documents, which are referred to in the report. It's there. Now it's for someone or some group of 3 or whatever it is to look at that and to call the witnesses before them, with any luck before they're all dead.